So hello and welcome to another Valorant tips and tricks video. Today we're going to be talking about defaulting. We're actually going to do a two-parter on defaulting and how to do it, because I feel like a lot of the videos that explain defaulting will tell you kind of, what it's there for and what to do with it, but not why those things are effective, why those things are good for you, and how they can help you win games. But first of all, let's explain some misconceptions about what a default is, because I feel like a lot of people will, mix up what a default is. I've drawn the barriers here for the attackers in yellow and the defenders in blue. And a lot of people, when you say default to them, will assume that, oh, we're just going to sit here and, just kind of wait and just kind of, not really do anything, particularly at lower ranks. They'll just think, oh, a default is when you, kind of all split off and just kind of go one by one to different points in the map. And I know that some of you will obviously know that that is not what a default is, but it is still important to explain to the people who maybe don't know, this is not what a default is, I should say. This is not what a default is, where you're just being passive. Now, you can be passive, and the idea of a default really is that you do want to live. You don't want to die early on. You don't just want to swing and take fights and die. That is not the point of a default. So it's not really a push, and it's not really just staying there in position. Now, sometimes you can stay in position, and you could call that a very passive default. I would call that more of a holding for a rush, and pro teams do this as well, particularly if their opponent is on a save and feel like, they might get a bit aggressive to, try and throw us off. So you can potentially, play a bit more passive on certain areas of the map for sure. For instance, if, say, that you're playing against a very aggressive Jet on B, you might not, start to walk up. You might just be a bit more passive and just kind of wait a bit to see if she does push. Those kind of things are all very doable, and that's absolutely fine. But in general, that is not what a default is. And the first thing is map control. And I'm going to give you an example of a time that I'm sure has happened to you in games and why map control is important. And we're going to do this by showing you what not a default looks like. Let's pretend we're just rushing A as a 5-stack, right? We're just going A as a full team. We're going in there, try and stop us if you can. And what this might lead to, of course, is that, you try and get into A, but you just can't, right? The rotates come in, you can't manage to get through this choke point here. And so you end up going, oh, well, maybe let's go back. And as you start to come back and the first couple players start to turn this corner, it turns out that, there's both this Reyna and this Jet just right in your face. And, the first person who turns the corner dies, and then the second person tries to trade them, but then they die. And all of a sudden you're in a 3v5 and you're caught in, this tiny little area of the map here. This is your map space, whereas the defenders have literally everything else. And obviously this is not going to go well for you, and you're going to lose the round. So that's the first point of a default. It's to take areas of the map. It's to stop the defenders from being able to do this. It's to, try and keep the defenders back to rotating only through their spawn if possible, and to, just keep them back in their parts of the map. And to explain, and this is a general rule of thumb, you shouldn't always, take this as gospel. It will depend for certain maps, but in general, a good rule of thumb is the areas that you want to take is in between the two barriers. Between your barrier and between the defender's barrier. If you can take that space, that will be great. So, on Ascent, for instance, it will be the area of B main, it will be the area of A main here, and it will be most of mid here coming up here. If you can take all of this space, that means that the defenders, the only way that they can rotate is through their own spawn, right? And so that will take them more time, or you are less likely to be caught off guard if they can only be in areas that you are expecting them to be in, their side of the map. So those are the areas that you want to take. So a good default might look something like this, where you have the Sky up here, the Jet up there, maybe the Sova's here, the Killjoy and the Astra might be up here. Now, as I've mentioned before, this isn't like a push. You're poking and prodding. So for instance, if this Sova comes here and it turns out that the Jet and the Reyna are right here staring him down, he should retreat. He should get out of there. He should live. He should not try and take this fight, and he should give up this space. If the defenders are pushing at him, he should just give it up. Because what that will mean, and when he tells his teammates that that is what's happening, maybe then this Jet and Sky think, oh, well, there must be some gaps here in this defense. If two are pushing out of B main, it probably means there's gaps. And you might, for instance, find yourself in a 2v1 fight here. You might kill this player here. And then all of a sudden, instead of these players being like, oh, look at us, we're aggressive, we're coming in at you. Now all of a sudden they find themselves in a bit of a pincer when, they're stuck in this tiny little area of the map, and they're in big trouble as they have to fight from two sides. So that is taking map control, is to just make sure that the defenders are pushed back to where they need to be. But again, this is not like a hard rule of you must take map control. It's more about, take as much as you can without dying. The second thing that is good about a default is that you gain info, and this is very, very important to you, and you want to gain that information as much as you can. Obviously, you will, one, find out who is on what site. You know, for instance, here, I've got the Jet and Reyna set up on B, and I've got Sova and Killjoy set up on A. Now, one of these, two of these agents are much easier to push against than the other two. Between Killjoy and Sova, there is a ton of things that they can do to stall out any push here. Whereas with Jet and Reyna, not so much, right? A push might be more effective against a Jet and a Reyna. And so it might not even be for this round, but it could be for the next round. If you know that those players are playing there, okay, well, we can probably push a Jet and a Reyna, and with good utility usage, we can probably force them into, unfavorable fights and win those fights. And they aren't going to be able to delay us nearly as much as a Killjoy and a Sova are. But also you'll pick up info about, where players like to play a lot. Does this player like to push into B main, this little corner here? Do they like to play on site? All of those things you might pick up on if you default and, start to work out, okay, which defenders are playing where and how do they like to play? Are they passive? Are they aggressive? All of those things will come into it and you'll get a common sense of what's going on. And I should say that, this is a good time to probably say that you want to be doing this particularly early on. Defaulting early on will help you a lot because you'll find out this information early and so therefore, get more rounds to use that information that you have about the different players on the opposing side. And the third thing you try and want to achieve, and this might not always be possible, but if you can, then that's really good, is trying to get out the utility from the enemy as well. Because let's say that, we have started the default, right? We've gone here and we've started to push A main, and this Killjoy, we've triggered her alarm bot, for instance, and she's used her 2 nano swarms there as well, and this Sova has seen us and he's darted here, but we've killed the dart, and we're just prodding, right? We're not actually committing to anything. We're just prodding. We're kind of faking that. Oh, we might come at you. You never know. He's used his dart. He's used his drone to check how many people are actually in there. He's used a shock dart to try and stop you as well. And all of a sudden, these 2 characters which have a lot of utility, well, now it's all gone. And now they can't use it anymore. And so now you have a real advantage in terms of being able to push these players who would normally have a lot of utility and ways to stop you. Well, now all of a sudden, if you want to push these players, it becomes a lot more possible because they've used all of their utility that would be good to try and stop that push. And so, for instance, let's say you've done that and you've defaulted, and then you just want to go quiet for a bit. You just want to go quiet and say, we will push A, but we'll wait for our teammates to come around, push as a nice stack, and then go in on these players that have, limited utility. And another good thing, and I should have mentioned this in the information part, is that obviously a default will limit your opponent's information. If you just rush a site, then the rotates are and they know that 4 or 5 players are there, well then they're just going to rotate as quickly as they can. But if you default, what you can then do is slowly group up, and the defenders, if they've seen someone on B, if they've seen people in mid, if they've seen people on A, well, they aren't going to rotate, or at least they shouldn't rotate because they're just guessing and they don't want to guess. And so what you'll often see is instead of having quick rotations and have to fight a 5v5 on a site, which won't be good for you, then instead you're fighting a 5v2, and it is going to be good for you because the defenders don't know where you are and you could have gone to either site. And this is a crucial point because I think a lot of people get this wrong, is you default with the idea that you are going to push later on as a group. It is not everyone push one lane as an individual. It's a poke and prod as an individual, and then we will group up, see what's happened in the round, and then we'll go as a group and push a site as we normally would. That is what a default is trying to do, and I feel like often people they overextend, particularly at lower ranks. They will overextend, they'll push too aggressively, they won't live, they'll die, and all of a sudden, you'll be in a 5v3 and you're wondering, this defaulting thing never really works because we just end up losing duels and end up in a 5v3. But that is not the point. The point is to live, poke and prod, and then group up, and then make your push once you've gained the information, once you've taken the map control, so you know that there's no big flank on either for the defenders, because they're going to be scared that someone's still out there. If you have shown in B, this Jet isn't going to go running up in B until it's way too late. And so that instance that I first showed you isn't going to happen. You know that the defenders are probably going to have to rotate through their own spawn, so they're going to be in angles that you predict them to be at, and that is going to give you the advantage because you're pushing with a utility advantage, with an information advantage, and with the idea that the defenders can only come from their own spawn or places that you would regularly expect them to be. And my final tip for a default is the spike, because often this is a mistake that a lot of people will make. Now, you can put a spike to a site with the idea of we'll start out with a default and we think we're going to go A. So maybe you'll leave the spike here, for instance. Or maybe you think we're going to go B. So you might leave the spike, somewhere safe here, for instance. Someone can pick it up on the way back of their rotation, something like that. One thing that I would say is, unless like, for instance, you could maybe do this in Astra, you're going to play super safe, you can then have the spike. But do not take the spike in a default and push it up. This is another thing that I think a lot of people get wrong, because as soon as you die here, if you do die, obviously the idea is that you won't, but you might, you don't know what the defenders are going to do necessarily, you might die. And then if the spike is down there, that kind of ruins the whole plan, because the whole plan is that the defenders aren't going to know where you're going to be. But as soon as the spike comes down here, then the defenders, if you're the only person there, the defenders can take this control, and all of a sudden they have spike, and guess what? You now have to fight back for this, so your whole default is ruined. So I would say most of the time, leave the spike, or, just leave it in a safe area where you can pick it up later after you've kind of done the information gathering portion of the round. That is what I would say. Just be a bit more patient, and definitely do not die with the spike. And so that is my defaulting guide to you all. I hope you found it pretty helpful and what you should be trying to do. Just a quick recap, you're aiming to obviously take map control, ideally in between the two barriers. That's the kind of space that you want to be occupying. But if the defenders are stopping you from doing that for whatever reason, then, just try and live. Living would be more important than trying to, desperately take that map control. Second thing is information gathering. If you can get the info on, who's where, what they're doing, positions they like to play, things that they do, then that is all great. That will help you out a lot. And obviously, if you can bait out as much utility as you can without using too much of your own, that would be quite nice as well, because that will obviously give you a utility advantage when you do go for that push into site, and that is something that you should be trying to do. So with that said, tomorrow I will be back with some default videos from pro teams, just to give you a sort of visual element of what a good default looks like. And we'll go through some of those rounds and talk about, what exactly happened and how they made it work. And then hopefully then you'll have a good understanding of what a default is, how it works, and how you should be using it. And then you'll be able to win quite a lot of rounds.